This time I'm playing with the top leaderboard Grandmaster Finley Pope 27. The competition consists of 6 games. You get 1 point by winning going first, 2 points by winning going second. The player who at the end has the biggest amount of points, wins the competition. And the first game is Brazil capital Conquest. The Grandmaster Finley selected the territory of Paranaso to force me to take the territory of Santa Catarina or might even place his capital here. Then he selected the territory of Mato Grosso do Sul, which is a usual place for a capital, and I selected the territory of Goiás, which is another common place for a capital. And then he selected the territory of Espírito Santo, as it is the territory in the Sudus continent which would block the way towards the continent of Sul the least. So his first territory selection was top-notch, but at the end he wasn't able to block my capital army from invading the continent of Sul, assuming I would place it on Goiás. And this is what I actually did. After the reveal I found out that he placed his army on Parana, but for the capital's placement he decided to go with Mato Grosso do Sul. What in my turn I did is invaded my opponent into the continent of Sul, leaving a bigger army there, so with main capital army becoming blocked from that continent, he couldn't easily recapture and intend to properly guard it. But then my opponent tried to counterattack that, fortified a bunch of troops from his capital as well. So then I actually decided to crush it, so to potentially get the attacker's advantage rather than giving it to my opponent, but I only lost 1 troop fewer than him. And then I captured the Nordeste continent, so my opponent, wanting to invade it and then to try properly guarding the Sul continent borders, would have to use a lot of troops and leave his capital weak. But my opponent didn't actually try guarding the Sul region. So with my gotten troops I just continued executing my plan, recapturing the Nordeste region and invading him into Sul with along of leaving a smaller army there. And then in the next turns I just continued recapturing the Nordeste region. And then capturing even more territories, since being of the advantage to increase it even more, as by seeing that my opponent wouldn't get a decent capital hit chance to take my capital down. And he actually let me hold over 11 territories, which led me of receiving 1 extra troop more. So then after trading in a set at 3 cards, by seeing that he is in a definitely losing situation if it's going to continue going like that, he decided to take an unfavorable 41 versus 31 capitals takedown, and since the success chance was only 5%, he decided to use manual rolls, which didn't help him at all and brought the winning percentage to absolute 0. And after the first game the result becomes 2-0 with me being in the lead. The second game is Supermax Prison with World Domination. And this is how our territory setup looked like. And since I assumed that my opponent will probably try to counter the easiest for me to capture continent, I decided to go for the 2 harder ones, with placing the most of troops to the hardest one, and a few troops army to the second hardest one. And that was awesome how it turned out, because my opponent set up one of his armies in the way to counter the easiest for me to go for continent, and then another army he placed to go for a continent himself. A sneaky play I found out he tried using is by placing the troop armies in the dead ends, so since I had to split and or use more troops in order to be sure to take over both of the continents, I left myself with weaker borders. But luckily enough his manual rolls weren't good enough to break through one of my borders. So then he captured 2 continents for himself. And while I could have tried invading him into both of his continents, I decided to rather play more safely and invade him into one, but completely taking over it. He invaded me into only one of the 3 continents, and having only one himself, the game was completely lost for him. So after 2 games the result becomes 3-0 with me being in the lead. The third game is Africa with World Domination. This is how our territory setup looked at the end. And my opponent had a few different options where to place his army to. He could have either placed his army to one of these territories, somewhere in the top, or into one of the territories of the rest of the map. And what I realized is that it would be the best for me to place my army into this territory, as even with me not predicting his army, he wouldn't be able to crush my army either. But actually I predicted his stack, so that was really fortunate. but what was unfortunate is that I didn't get the attacker's advantage at all. I lost the same number of troops as him with me crushing his biggest army. But luckily enough I was still able to invade him into the continent I let him take. In his turn he captured these territories and this continent with the 2 troops in the middle, which I think was a bad idea for me to crush them, as I might have gotten a bad blitz roll, so I think I should have rather invaded him through the top territory and go on capturing the territories in the top. But luckily I lost no troops when crushing his 2 troops army. And then we were going back and forth capturing and recapturing each other territories, so with me just getting more and more into the territories lead since I was getting a higher territorial troop bonus by having more territories. The game continued with us trading in our sets, and it really looked that I'm dominating the game, and I was, as even with my opponent getting a set at 3 cards he only brought me to 18 territories. So with me trading in a set at 4 cards, that was a very visible GG. After the 3 games the result becomes 4-0 with me being in the lead. The 4th game is Simple World with capital Conquest. And since I thought that my opponent is going to place his capital on Scandinavia, I thought of placing my army on Brazil. But since my opponent put his capital in the territory of the Guianas, I decided to place my capital on the mainland Europe. So I crushed my opponent's army on Scandinavia, getting the attacker's advantage of 3 troops, and then, instead of fully fortifying my army on the mainland Europe, I tried guarding Africa as well, because even if he invaded it, he would unleash my capital army towards South America, so with that he wouldn't actually be able to properly guard Brazil. Luckily for me he failed to break through Scandinavia with his newly gotten troops, but then he managed to do it with his other army, and then very unluckily for me got the attacker's advantage of even 5 troops when crushing my North African army. So the situation wasn't really looking that great like I thought at first. As then in the next turn he managed to invade me through my guarded bottom African border and capture Australia for himself. I invaded him, but probably that was a mistake for me to capture 2 extra territories, as getting down to only 6 troops, my opponent could have gotten a 69% chance capital blitz roll if getting to me with 12 troops. So with him not doing that, it gave me the chances to try making a comeback. I managed to break through both South America and Australia, with getting the attacker's advantage of 3 troops when crushing his Brazilian army, and then losing the same amount of troops on as the Australian guarding army. I left the 5 troops in South America, which was a mistake, as with him getting the attacker's advantage of 3 troops and then leaving 5 troops on his border, I could have failed breaking, and this is what happened. So the right decision would have been to fortify these 5 troops to North Africa, as with him crushing them there he would have unleashed my capital army towards South America. Then I decided to capture Africa with Europe, so he would have to do more troop splits, and then getting very lucky to get a set at 3 cards I decided to trade it in and go for my opponent's capital, as I saw that the situation was completely losing for me. That was a 41% chance, so I decided to actually immediately take it rather than doing manual rolls, but I failed, and the result after 4 games becomes 4-2 with my opponent getting closer to me. The 5th game is France capital Conquest. And with a blizzard being in the center continent, my opponent selected one of these continents' territories, forcing me to take another one, which were probably going to be our capital spots. So with that in the territory selection, my goal was to not become blocked from any of the continents looking from that territory. At the end I actually became blocked from the southern France continent, so with that I had to do the troop split and place a decent amount of troops in the territory of northern Midi-Pyrenees, so with my opponent crushing that army, he would unleash my capital's army towards that continent. And while I predicted my opponent, he didn't predict me, as with placing his army not next to that territory, he wasn't actually able to crush it to potentially get the attacker's advantage. And then my goal was simple, is by capturing those continents to make my opponent waste as many troops as possible, so with like the third or fourth round coming I could potentially get a good blitz roll to crush his capital, so like assuming that besides invading me, he would also consider to try guarding something which could make his capital relatively weak. That didn't happen though, as my opponent was keeping his capital strong. Also, as you can see, I was always keeping some troops in that territory, which with my opponent crushing would unleash my capital's army towards the southern France continent. But even if that army would have become too small and with my opponent putting a decent amount on that border, there would have still been another border which my opponent would have needed to guard. So that wasn't really looking promising for my opponent to hold anything. Right here my opponent tried crushing that army, but getting a bad blitz roll he failed, which led me receiving a 3 troops bonus for a turn. Then we were just invading each other for a multiple turns until I captured the northern France continent trying to properly guard it. My opponent didn't invade it, so I've got the 2 troop bonus, but then after trading an A set he got the attacker's advantage when crushing these armies. Right here I had the 74% chance capital hit if placing the 20 troops on my capital, but I decided not to take it because I was in a winning situation anyway. So it was just better to wait till 100% chance blitz roll or so. As you can see, I took over the northern France region again. And then, at this moment, my opponent, trading an A set at 4 cards, thought that he had enough of it and decided to take 57 versus 45, which had 0% chance, so unless he would have gotten some good manual rolls. He also used the slider, which led our armies to become equally sized but with a low amount of troops, meaning that getting good manual rolls he could actually get some better success chance, but he didn't, and after the 5 games the result becomes 6-2 with me being in the lead. The 6th game is Qing Dynasty capital Conquest. My opponent selected this territory as his first territory pick, while I selected this one, which were probably going to be our capital placement choices. And probably unsurprisingly they were. My opponent in his turn brought me down to even 7 territories, while I him to 13 of them, which was a mistake because it led him to receive 1 extra troop bonus, so I should have definitely captured 2 territories more. But then in the second turn my opponent made a mistake too by not capturing 1 more territory, because with me having over 11 territories led me of receiving 1 extra troop bonus. Realizing my mistake in the last turn, I actually tried to count how many territories I need to capture and whether I would make it capturing the territories I want to capture. And yes, I achieved my goal, capturing 1 territory more because I wanted to capture that continent, and with that my opponent would have to waste more troops by wanting to invade me into all of my continents. My opponent at the end of his turn ended up with only 7 troops on his capital, which led me of getting the 99% success chance blitz roll, which I definitely decided to take, and with that I won the game. The final result becomes 8-2 with me winning the series. Now for more 1v1 competitions click on the playlist on the right, and for more 1v1 strategy tips click on the playlist on the left.